Week 6 of Advanced Criminological Theory is about sexual assault. Before I begin this week's lecture, I want to remind you that your term papers are due by midnight on the Monday of week 7, at this point, it is past the deadline for submitting drafts. So be sure to proofread carefully. And I hope that I'm looking forward to reading quality papers from each and every one of you. Okay, this week, like I said, is about sexual assault. Understanding, before we can talk about sexual assault, realize that understanding sexual assault requires a bit of understanding about normal sexuality, and maybe even more of an understanding of normal sexuality than abnormal sexuality or abnormal psychology. As frightening as it is to understand, about 65% of college males have engaged in some form of sexual misconduct, including sexual conduct with children, coercive sex with women, fraudage, obscene phone calls, etc. There is a great deal of overlap between informal, formal, and medical definitions of sexual deviance, and so there, particularly cultural explanations, or cultural definitions of sexual assault, result in a lot of young men committing what may be legally a sex crime without intending to, without really realizing it. Also, understand that sexual norms, what we consider to be appropriate sexual behavior, is relative across time and space, or time and place. The designation of a variety of sexual practices as a disease and or objectively abnormal is inconsistent across cultures. Think about sex with minors. There was a time in the world where women were married off at 13, 14 years old, and then often married to much older men. And this was not considered to be abnormal. There was a time when sex outside of the marriage relationship was considered to be deviant. For most of American culture today, that's not true. And we're starting to see even, it's sad to think, but even in our Christian culture, abstinence prior to marriage is, while it's still the norm we talk about, it's not the norm we engage in, for a large part. Homosexuality, not always considered deviant, and it's becoming to a point where in our society it's no longer considered deviant. You consider Greek culture in Plato's day. It wasn't just considered normal, it was expected for older wise men to take on young mentors and teach them everything about everything, including sexual behavior. Our norms have certainly changed, and so what we consider to be sexual assault changes with the norms. Today, what is considered against the law or illegal, not always so. At least maybe this is one of these areas that we've progressed in. Also understand there is a great deal of disparity between the reality of sexual practice in American society and that which is considered deviant. There are a lot of things in our society that if we were to talk about it in public, we would say, "Oh, that's horrible, that's deviant, you shouldn't be doing that." And then behind closed doors, those same people are often practicing those acts. So what is normal sexuality? Normal sexuality, what we consider to be normal sexuality, is rooted in Judeo-Christian doctrine and criminal law. Normal sexuality is, at least in public, considered to be monogamous, procreative, heterosexual intercourse between married persons. What is normal in a statistical sense This is, what I mean is the behavior that most people actually engage in behind closed doors does not naturally coincide with social prescriptions for normal sexual behavior. And then, like I mentioned before, what's normal in one culture, time or place, may be deviant in another. Human sexual behavior is both learned and instinctual and impacted by a wide range of biological, psychological, and social cultural influences. So that's normal. What's abnormal? What's deviance? Sexual deviance, I'll give you, try to define it, textbooky terms. Would say the types of behavior viewed as sexually deviant are socially constructed, and again, change in time and space. The amount of force with which sexually deviant behaviors are socially controlled and officially targeted is dictated by politics and demographic shifts. But sexual deviance, if you want a textbook type term, definition, we would say sexual deviant is sexual behavior that violates social sexual norms. We're talking about sexual disorders, as we're talking along these lines. A century ago, Kraft Ebing, we're talking about 1906, so more than a century ago, published a book called Psychopathia Sexualis, documented case studies of sexual disorders, including fetishism, sadism, transsexualism, machinism, transvestitism, nymphomania, sexual bondage, and lust murder, and called all of these disorders. Obviously, from the list you can tell there are some of these things that are not considered normal by our wonderful American culture today. Today, sexual disorders are identified in the DSM-4. They are under the heading sexual and gender identity disorders. Disorders in this category include gender identity disorders, sexual dysfunctions, and paraphilias. Gender identity disorder, characterized by cross-gender identification and persistent discomfort with one's assigned sex. Other disorders are found in there, and most of these are related to the sex act themselves, different things that people do that may be considered strange and unusual. These behaviors are associated with some form of individual or interpersonal distress, and some but not all of sexual disorders are crimes. And so there are quite a few of these things that we consider to be disorders that are not illegal. Paraphilias, on the other hand, paraphilia is defined as kind of Latin for abnormal love. Unlike disorders, many of these are criminal in nature and include such behaviors as genital exposure, sexual behavior with children, non-consenting rubbing on others, that's frottage. There's quite a long list of these things. Sex crimes are differentiated from disorders and sexual deviance in that they are behavioral acts that violate the law. From a legal perspective, sex offenses are acts deemed both sexually deviant and a threat to individuals and public safety. So if you have a fetish, if you like feet, that's not a sex offense because it's not a danger to public safety, unless you're frottage on people's feet. I don't know. Crazy. Offenses that generally fall under the category of sex crimes are those in which the offender engages in a sexual act with a non-consenting victim. Sexual assault or rape, child molestation, child rape or child sexual assault, sexual misconduct with a minor, indecent liberties, voyeurism, sexually violating human remains, necrophilia. Custodial sexual misconduct are examples of sexual behaviors legally defined as sex crimes. If we look at the penal code in Texas, fairly well written, broad definition, defines sexual assault is unwanted sexual conduct, unwanted, unconsensual sexual conduct between persons. And so, our current definitions include The idea that both men and women can be sexually assaulted, that persons can sexually assault individuals of either opposite or same gender. These definitions are not all the same. You consider the FBI definition of forcible rape, and then we're talking about a definition that says that defines rape as basically carnal knowledge of a woman forcible and against her will, and denies such definitions deny that men can be raped or that women can be raped by other women, and not just men. Let's see. Sexual psychopathy and sexual predator laws are a big topic today. The terms sexual predator and sexual psychopath are legal terms used to impose civil commitment of dangerous sex offenders whose behavior is associated with a mental illness with pathological tendency to reoffend. So again, sexual predator, sexual psychopath, these are terms we've used in the past. They're terms we use in order to indefinitely incarcerate somebody that we consider to have, or that we've shown with a preponderance of the evidence to have a mental disorder related to, that's causing sexual offenses that would result in the individual having a high risk of reoffending. While a subset of sexual offenders are psychopathic, most sex offenders are not. Most psychopaths are not sex offenders. They tend to just murder. The legal definition of sexual psychopathy and sexual predator in the past and today are not synonymous with traditional or contemporary psychological definitions of psychopathy. Assumptions that sexual psychopath laws, these laws used to civilly commit offenders are, because understand, civil commitment of sex offenders, what it does is incarcerate someone indefinitely based on the belief that they will commit a crime in the future. It's not incarceration because of a crime that's been committed, but essentially incarceration based on future dangerousness. This flies in the idea of our justice system, particularly since in many states civil commitment can be done on a preponderance of the evidence rather than beyond a reasonable doubt. And the idea is you civilly commit someone that you can prove in civil court is because of mental disorder or defect likely to reoffend again, and then you don't put them in jail, you don't put them in prison, you put them in a treatment facility. But if you look at these treatment facilities, they might as well be prison. You're basically depriving someone of liberty without due process of law. But we're calling it civil commitment so that we can sneak it by the courts. These laws are based on several assumptions. The first being that there is a mental disability that relates to sexual psychopathy, that people that suffering from sexual psychopathy are at an increased risk of offending. So these sexual predators, they are this way because of mental disorder, and they're more likely to offend. The third assumption in this list is that they can be identified by mental health professionals, and that their dangerousness can be predicted by the same. With all these things being true, the next assumption being that treatment is available and that a large number of these people can be cured. And so while we're saying we're going to civilly commit these individuals indefinitely, we're also saying that they can be cured, and then when they're cured, they can be released. When you take one of these sexual predators, you civilly commit them, and then you leave them in a treatment facility until some doctor says he's cured. And what ends up happening is the doctors never say he's cured, and we have someone whose liberty has been deprived for not a crime that they've committed, but a crime they might commit. Am I saying that the wonderful alternative is we let these people out in society for free? I don't think that's such a great idea, but I have a hard time accepting the indefinite incarceration of somebody. The indefinite deprivation of liberty based on future dangerousness and not crimes committed. There needs to be a better way. Let's see, there are special laws. I'm just going to mention these laws that have to do with sexual psychopaths. You're familiar about them. You've read them in the textbook. These are laws such as the Jacob Welterling crimes against children and sexually psychopathic offenders. Uh, the Jacob Welterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act, which, when passed, and these laws I mentioned were all passed in 96, required states to establish specific requirements for persons convicted of crimes against minors and convicted of sexually violent offenses. But that's all it did. It's states, you have to establish requirements for these people. So what you got to do about it. Then in 96, you have the 96 Amendment to the Welterling Act, known as Megan's Law, the one everyone's most familiar with. This is the one that actually requires states to release registration information to the public when it is deemed necessary for public safety. And then you also have the Pam Lynchner Act, which is an amendment to the Welterling Act passed in 96 that requires lifetime registration for certain serious offenders and recidivists, and directs the FBI to keep a sex offender database. The way this works in Texas is if you're convicted of sexual assault, you have a 10-year registration period. If you're convicted of aggravated sexual assault or a sexual assault case, any other sexual assault, any other sex crime dealing with a minor, with the exception of indecency with a minor, you have to register for life. What we end up is we get a lot of sex offenders with child victims pleading guilty to indecency with a child so they can get the 10-year registration rather than a lifetime. There are problems with sex offender registration. These are laws passed out of fear. A lot of it media-generated fear, by the Lynchner family, by the Megan Kafka family, and these laws had a good intention. Now, don't say Dr. Day thinks the Megan's laws are a bad thing. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that they were well-intentioned laws. They were passed out of fear and anger. And they provide law enforcement with a way to track sex offenders, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem with sex offender registration laws is it further ostracizes these offenders. Understand, the only way to truly rehabilitate an offender is to make them a part of the community again. As long as offenders continue to be ostracized from mainstream society, as long as we tell them you can't be a part of our little group, they're going to seek companionship somewhere. They're going to seek social contact somewhere. We are made for community as a people, and we're going to seek it out regardless. With a lot of these laws, we do things restricting where sex offenders live. We end up with areas of jurisdictions that are full of sex offenders, where you get the clumping of sex offenders. You get them living all in the same area. When they live that close to each other, and probation officers, while they can say, put in the probation conditions, parole conditions cannot associate with another known offender, and they know the reality is when sex offender registration laws limit where they can live, they have no other choice but to live around other sex offenders. Think about it. When you get together with your friends, you talk about your common interests. What do you think a bunch of child molesters talk about when they get together outside of treatment? They talk about their common interests and they get better at what they do. This is what a lot of people would refer to as the law of unintended consequences. The law, Megan's Law, the Pam Lynchner Act, the Jacob Welterling Act were all very well intended. But people didn't consider the unintended consequences. These things that prevent sex offenders from rejoining society. I know some of you are thinking we don't want them to rejoin society. Well, if we don't let them, if they're not a part of us, they're going to keep victimizing us. And so the only other choice is either we bring them back into society or we lock them up forever, or we execute them. Those are our choices. What's doing now is not working. There are places where restrictions on where sex offenders live are so strict that offenders, because they can't live outside the county they're paroled to, They're living under overpasses and in public parks. Uh, and parole officers are letting it happen. They know where to look for their sex offenders. Like, go to the overpass under I-10. That's where they're at. Not a good idea. We've got to come up with something better. Do we still, if these people are at an increase at reoffending, do we need to take additional steps for public safety? Yes. Do we need to come up with steps that don't increase the likelihood of reoffending and decreasing the odds that we'll catch them when they do? Yeah, we need better solutions. All right, let's talk about types. Let's see. Sex crimes can be categorized into 3 general types. Yes, I'm changing subjects again. Within each type, there are 3 distinct subtypes. We'll call them rape, child molestation, and sexual homicide. And let's talk about rape first, or sexual assault. There are types of rape. Now, keep in mind, when I talk about types of rape, Texas is such a broad definition, ain't but the one, sexual assault. But other types of rape in other jurisdictions, you might have things called statutory rape. Of course, sexual assault, unwanted, non-consensual sexual contact between individuals. Statutory rape, for states that have statutory rape statutes, Texas does not. But statutory rape considers sex with a minor with or without consent. Understand, in Texas, this crime does not exist. It's sexual assault. If it's sexual assault, if your victim is a minor, consent no longer matters, and it becomes aggravated sexual assault. There is rape by fraud. This is having sexual relations with a consenting adult under fraudulent conditions. In other words, if you're in the club and you convince the woman to have sex with you because you've told her that you're going to marry her and you're a rich billionaire, that's sex by fraud. And in some jurisdictions, that is a crime. Particularly if you tell them you're going to marry them. Old laws. There is date rape. That is defined technically as sexual assault that occurs in the context of a dating relationship. Date rape, the thing I'll say about date rape is that it is probably more traumatic than any other type of sexual assault, because the victims are more likely to blame themselves or be blamed for the assault. And so date rape can be extremely traumatic. How common was the incidence and prevalence of rape? Understand, sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes. Women tend not to report it. Women are much better about reporting it than men are, but it goes largely unreported. Victims are embarrassed, they're humiliated, they're afraid. And so sexual assault very often goes unreported. About 1 in 5 of all women, about 1 in 5 will be sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime. 22% of college women experience some type of sexual victimization while on a date. 15% of all college men will admit to forcing sexual activity. Between, let's say, 82 and 92, we saw an increase in sexual assault reporting, based generally on a high level of community awareness, influence of the women's movement, increase of training and its sensitivity of the police, and changes that made evidence gathering easier on victims. But since 1992, the reporting rate has gone down again, and so far, no one's been able to explain it. I talk about youth. 29% of all sexual assault victims are minors, particularly minors less than 11 years of age. 32% of sexual assault victims between ages 11 and 17, and then 22% between 18 and 24. About relationship between victims and offenders, about a quarter of all rape victims knew their offender. knew the rapist before the offense occurred. Um, about a fifth, 21.9% or so, of women who are raped by husbands or ex-husbands. 19.5% are raped by boyfriends or ex-boyfriends. 10% by relatives. 14.6% are raped by non-relatives, friends, or neighbors. The point here being most sexual assaults, most, are committed by someone known to the victim. How are victims impacted? Let's talk about victim impact of sexual assault for a minute. With our current justice system, and things are getting a little better, but in our current justice system, victims are victimized twice, sometimes, and maybe as often as 3 times. You're victimized. If you're a woman, you're victimized first by the rapists themselves, and then you are victimized by the system. The evidence collection process is still invasive. The trial process is very traumatic. And so, more than any other crime, rape victims tend to experience the crime psychologically multiple times, which is a reason for underreporting. Many victims don't want to go through this. Psychological effects of rape. Upon reporting the crime, victims and survivors must recall and describe the event in vivid detail to the police, who are most often men. Though police are getting better with the use of victim advocates, female police officers, it's another way women get victimized. They have to explain in great detail what happened to a male police officer. This is victimizing in and of itself. And then victims and survivors must withstand often negative reactions from their family members, where they get questioned. What did you do to bring this on? Why? What did you say no? What did you do to lead the offender on? Again, it's something that's getting better in our society, but more often than not, victims get blamed by friends and acquaintances and family. So they're victimized again. If the case goes to trial, victims again must describe the event in detail in public, and then withstand the defense attorney's attempt to damage her credibility. Now, states have limited the tactics defense attorneys can use. They can't bring up the victim's prior sexual history, what's popularly known as rape shield laws. But still, it's a very public telling of the crime. It is humiliating. It is psychologically traumatic. And another reason why rape is very much underreported. Women don't want to go through that again. And that's just psychological effects. And you talk about cost. Rape has a lot of costs that people don't always think. There's missed work. There's child care costs, medical expenses as a result of the sexual assault, expenses related to psychological harm caused by the crime, and then psychological harm caused by the trial. There's transportation costs involved. There is almost a pathological need for increased security. Sexual assault victims often make vast changes in their lifestyle. They move, they buy expensive security systems and new locks. They suffer psychologically from sleeplessness, a great deal of anxiety, depression, also very common among sexual assault victims. And so, it's funny, murder is the crime we punish the most harsh in this country. But sometimes I feel, and this is personal opinion, just weigh in on this question on the discussion. You can weigh in on it if you want. I often feel like sexual assault harms victims even more. Once you're dead, you're not feeling pain anymore. Well, you might, the whole burn in hell thing, once but it's over. You've been murdered, it's over. Um, Sexual assault, the pain, the trauma, the consequences of the victims lasts for years and decades. In terms of impact on victims. Rape maybe have a larger impact than even murder. Oh, men who rape. Let's talk about offender characteristics. Most rapists, most sexual assaulters, rapists is an easier term to deal with. Most rapists, 45.8% of them are under age 25. About 16-17% under age 18. This is probably underreported. The reality is probably about 30% of rapes are committed by kids, by juveniles. Most rapists tend to have extensive offense histories. Juvenile sex offenders often commit a variety of other offenses before committing sexual assault. It's very rarely the first crime a kid commits. One study found that over half of juvenile sex offenders have committed some sort of animal cruelty. And juveniles are compared to adults, juveniles are much more likely to have co-offenders in a sexual assault. Some other demographic type stuff. Almost 50% of rapists are unemployed or have an unstable employment history, except for child molesters. Child molesters tend to have very stable employment histories. 2/3 of rapists have never been married. 66% except for child molesters, 2/3 of which have been married. A strange dichotomy there. There are some assumptions about why men commit rape. There are four fundamental assumptions. One being uncontrollable impulses or urges, the loss of normal restraint or self-control, the assumption that the rapist is driven by powerful biological impulses. Another assumption is that rape may be related to mental illness, rape being symptomatic of a mental disorder or an addiction. A third assumption may be momentary loss of control precipitated by unusual circumstances or substance use. And the fourth assumption is victim instigation, that the victim somehow provoked the rape. All four of these attribute causes beyond the rapist himself and are not supported by empirical evidence. I bet as I was going through those four things, some of you were starting to get, Dr. Day's full of word can't say at the Baptist College. And by the time I got to victim instigation, you were probably like, man's full of it. I ain't listening to this guy. No. None of those four things are supported by empirical research. However, they tend to be believed by the public. People believe these things. This is rapists. This is why people rape. None of them are true. As far as we know empirically, not a single one of them is true. Why do men rape? We don't know. Maybe we'll see if we can figure it out. Before I get there, I have in my notes here to divide rape for you into two groups: deniers and admitters. Admitters are rapists that take responsibility when they're caught, and deniers are those that justify their behavior and blame their victim, or one of those four assumptions. Okay, how does one become a sex offender? And this is not a how-to video, by the way. This is how does someone become a sex offender. Literature on the development of sex offenders consists of two distinct avenues of theory and research. There's etiological theories that attempt to explain the developmental process that set the stage for sex offending behavior. And then there are theories that deal with risk assessment, explaining sex offending behavior in terms of risk and protective factors that make a person more or less inclined to commit a sex offense. Probably better than going these two routes is to look in an integrative development model. for the development of sex offending behavior. Um, and there's about 5 points to this model, 5 things in development five factors that may lead to the development of sex offending behavior. The first factor is developmental factors. These are things like abuse and rejection, attachment problems. We certainly know that victims of child sexual abuse are more likely to become sex offenders themselves. Peer rejection, abnormal attachment to others can also be factors that lead towards sex offenses. Let's see. The second factor are static factors. These are factors that are things about the individual that are not subject to change. These are persistent factors. These can be psychosocial problems like antisocial personality disorder. Things like the person's never been married, number of past offenses, things that don't change. The third category is stable dynamic factors. These are offense supportive cognitions, or basically thinking patterns that are supportive of sexual offending behavior. Other stable dynamic factors include the level of interpersonal functioning, how well the individual interacts with other people, and then self-regulation problems. Fancy way of saying self-control issues. The fourth set of factors are acute dynamic factors. These are things like psychological arousal, deviant thoughts and fantasies, an abnormal need for intimacy, and affective states, emotional states. Remember defect and affective states, so emotional states. And then finally, the final factor is triggering events or contextual risk factors in context. These are things like victim access, social dislocation, substance use, relationship conflict, antisocial peers, non-cooperation with supervision. All of these factors work together to create the sex offender. When we talk about things like, what do I say here? We talk about things about how does a person develop deviant sexual preferences, or urges, or deviant sexual fantasies. These acute dynamic factors. When we talk about this, realize that no one really decides what their sexual attraction will be, whether they're going to be attracted to males, females, adults, or children. And this is the argument of the homosexual lobby. They say we're born this way. Personally, I'm not a biologist. I don't get into the debate as to whether or not someone is born that way. What we do know is no one really ever decides. They don't wake up one morning and decide, you know what, I like little boys. They don't get up in the morning. Some guy doesn't get up in the morning and says, you know what, I know all my friends like girls, but just something about a six-pack abs at the locker room with the guys. Just really, no one really decides. Our sexual offending behavior is more associated with static and dynamic risk factors, and a particular developmental history, those factors I just talked about. I think, and when we talk about who we choose to be attracted to, this is my thought on this, is that it doesn't matter. The homosexual lobby says, "Well, we're born this way. We can't help it. You're stereotyping and discriminating against us." And I don't know if they're born that way. But you know what? We're all born sinful. That's what the Bible teaches us. I don't think it matters. I think they're bringing up an argument that there's no basis in the argument. It doesn't matter if you're not born that way. We are the higher creation of God. You look at the Genesis story. God spoke the universe into being. He spoke the earth into being. He spoke, and the earth was formed. He spoke and separated land from the water. He spoke and created the stars. Let there be light. He spoke, and the animal kingdom burst into being. And then he stuck his hands in the mud and molded us and breathed life into man. We were created different. We were created with the freedom of choice. And so no one decides what their sexual attraction will be. It doesn't matter if it's born into you. If there's a homosexual DNA, it doesn't matter. We are people. We're special. We choose. We don't excuse other behavior for other reasons. We can't excuse sexual offending because people were born a certain way. Heterogeneity is the rule in the terms of developmental pathway to sex offending. In other words, there are just a zillion different ways people get to this. But it is choice. There are things that predispose the choice. There are things in the social environment, in the biological makeup. There are things there are mental disorders that will alter or affect our ability to choose. Factors such as sexual abuse in childhood, attachment disruptions in infancy, dysfunctional family environment, conditional processes, social learning, biological predispositions to mental disorder, or particular personality traits that appear to shape sex or gender identity offending behavior. There are things that affect our ability to choose. But we do choose. So what causes the urge? What causes the predisposition to become action? While the development of the urge to sexually offend is determined by biological, psychological, or sociological environmental conditions beyond the offender's control, the decision to act on the urge to commit a sex offense falls within the bounds of free choice, free will, and conscious choice for the most part. Psychological, routine activity, opportunity, phenomenological factors play a role in whether or not urges to sexually offend will be acted upon. But sexual offending occurs when vulnerable individuals experience stress, proximate risk factors such as mental illness, substance abuse, exposure to pornography, and are in close proximity to an available victim in the absence of guardian and social controls. These factors are powerful, situational, contextual factors that fuel fantasy development and facilitate sexual behavior. But understand, it's choice. I'll urge you to look in the textbook about the MTC R3 for classifying rapists, the 4 major types, the 9 subtypes. I'm not going to read them to you. Look at the Groth typology, the 3, the anger rape, the power rape, the sadistic rape. I'll just kind of overview those for you real quick. Anger rape, the offender uses more force than necessary for compliance, that engages in sexual acts that are degrading to victims. It expresses contempt towards victims through language and action. The power rapist, the assailant seeks to establish power and control over the victim. The amount of force used depends on the degree of submission by the victim. The sex is the offender's method of asserting identity, authority, and domination rather than sexual gratification. A lot of prison rape is this type of assault. And then there is sadistic rape, the last type in the Groth typology. This includes both sexual and aggressive components. The offender gains gratification through pain and humiliation suffered by the victim. The event usually involves some sort of bondage or torture. Victims are often stalked, abducted, abused, and then sometimes murdered. And on that note, murdered, I'm going to end part one of this week's lecture and continue in part two by talking about sexual homicide.